Hello, everybody. Good morning. Happy Friday. Welcome to this session, The View from the Top. Thank you for being with us this morning. It's going to be a really great discussion, dialogue around transformation, organizational change, the future of museums. I'm Jeff Insko. I'm with the Innovation Studio at Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh, which is the Carnegie Museum of Art, Carnegie Museum of Natural History, the Andy Warhol Museum, and the Carnegie Science Center. I'm going to be co-moderating with my good friend Chad Weinert here.
Thank you, Jeff. I am Chad Weinert. I'm an independent museum technologist and strategist out of Durham, North Carolina. And let's go over a little bit of housekeeping. The session format, we've got some broad kind of buckets of topics that we've prepped a little bit for, but we want to keep it very free-flowing, and we want to keep audience questions to the fore and get to them as quickly as possible, right? We have a URL to ask a question, a Google Slides feature, so take note of that. Visit that URL. It's a great way to get a question in. I will also be roaming the crowd, so we're going to try to get questions on the mic, and if it's too much of a struggle, we'll just be repeating your question into the mic so that we'll have it on tape as well. Hashtag is up here as well. It's hashtag MCN2016, so please use that for back channel too. All right.
All right, just to set up and frame this a bit. When it comes to ideas like transformation, we've been talking about this stuff for a long time, right? This is a picture from 1999 and an email station here at MCN. And in fact, MCN was founded in the 60s, right, around digitizing collections and integrating those collections. And we're celebrating MCN's 50th year next year. So, we've been talking about it a while, right? And over the last several years, the museum technology community has been making really great inroads and progress, and we've seen this dialogue start to scale horizontally, right? We're seeing more curators attend this conference. We're seeing more educators attend this conference. And I think, we really want to see this scale vertically as well, which is why we're having this conversation today. And, the idea that, we're fortunate to have this amazing panel and to start to hear how senior leaders perceive this change, perceive the impact of all of this discussion that we've been having, and hopefully it will inspire some insight when you discuss this with your leadership at your museum too. So that's kind of the frame of all this. And the panel we have here today, Shelley Bernstein from the Barnes, we have Nick Honeysett from Balboa Park, Joellen Parker here on the end from Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh, and Susan Taylor from New Orleans Museum of Art. So let's start it off. Catalysts for transformation. What are the things that are causing this? So let me just start off maybe for Joellen. There's a lot of talk about the need for museums to fundamentally change, right? To remain relevant in the 21st century. Do you believe that this is true? And if so, how do museums start to implement these changes?
Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I do believe that it's true. My joke about this is that if we don't get serious about recognizing that it's true, there's going to be a time before too long when the only tours given in our facilities start with some sentence like, there used to be these things called museums, right? How do we start with the transformation? This is something I've talked about a fair amount, I think, in the 2 years that I've been in the museum world, having just come from higher education to the position I hold now. We have to spend, 10 times as much time looking up and out as we do looking down and in. We spend a lot of time looking down and in and thinking about how we would like to conduct our business. And my view is really that how we would like to conduct our business means almost nothing, because the whole question is, how does the world demand that we conduct our business today? So I think we have to look up and out. I think we have to think about what the world and the communities that we serve needs and wants us to do, and be willing to respond to that, letting go of templates or expectations that we may have formed at a much earlier point in our careers.
Excellent. This idea of looking out, kind of an audience and a visitor focus is something that's come up in our conversations before. I'd love, Susan, I'd love to have you talk a little bit about kind of perhaps a new orientation toward the audience.
Yes, I'd like to just speak specifically for a moment about New Orleans as kind of a testbed site for new strategies with museum engagement. It's a city that has 72 neighborhoods, very distinct identities and cultures and communities. And I think that for any institution, ours as in particular, the engagement with those communities and identifying what it is that they want from a museum, what it is that they expect, and what engages them. So I think one of the most critical strategies for us, and I think for many art museums, is to go to their space and make their space our space, and to begin a strong and broad and deep cultural conversation about expectations, ideas, and identities, because everyone connects to a visual image or an object in a different way. And to find that point of intersection between what a museum does, says, creates, and what a community embraces and needs is a very important point of convergence.
Great. Shelley, in your role, your new role as Chief Experience Officer at the Barnes, you kind of have one foot in the tech world, another foot in the more holistic experience. What are you seeing at the Barnes, or maybe in the sector, that's causing urgency for fundamental change in museums, if anything?
So we talk about change a lot, right? And I think, in some ways we're preaching to the choir. We're all out here and we're saying, hey, we all have to change, we all have to be relevant, we all have to do X, Y, and Z. And that's true, but I'm also an experienced person, right? So, it was sort of interesting. The Barnes, when it was in Marion, which was a suburb of Philadelphia, did one thing very, very well out there. And I don't know that we necessarily needed to change anything in that specific place. When the Barnes moved into the center of Philadelphia, suddenly our mandate was very, very different and became about, how do we have audiences that are as diverse as that city itself now that we're in this new location. So all of a sudden, everything changed because the mandate of the institution changed. And I think we can have institutions that maybe don't necessarily need to change and they'll do just fine. And we have institutions that need great change because of some of the things that their directors are trying to do, and that's also just fine, but I don't think it's an across-the-board sort of mandate.
Do we have some questions coming in from the crowd? Chad?
Yes, there are. The questions coming in are, there's 3 of them, and several more after that, and they're primarily focused on internal staff and developing capacity and skill sets within an institution, but also recognizing what's already there. One question is, how do you identify and promote the high potential digital employees that you already have? Nick.
Being the only person who's not in a museum now. Well, I work with a lot of museums on digital strategy, and part of the process that actually Chad, when he was at BPOC, we created this process, and part of it was within the framework itself, we try and find who the folks are who have the skill sets to kind of deliver on the strategy. So we come in and work with an organization and help them understand, these are the things that are important, these are vision and goals, here's a framework to, become digitally literate. But during the process, certainly through things like design thinking, we try and include folks across the institution and identify those ones who demonstrate the skill sets that we're looking for. And it's not necessarily about, understanding all the technologies that are out there. It's really the capacity to learn. Just because you're 25 doesn't mean that you know how to use social media. Everybody can learn what the important things are in social media, what the different frameworks are, what the demographics are for the different ones. So I think, any kind of transformation. I think there was a session yesterday or the day before about, real transformation is really a bottom-up process, and that's where it becomes sustainable. If it's from the top down, it's less sustainable. Did that even answer the question?
One of the things I was going to say is very similar to what you were saying, Nick. We're trying hard to identify people and help build skill sets and give people a sense of excitement and dynamic by making sure we get people out of their silos. So creating something like the Innovation Studio that Jeff leads, creating something called a Nexus program that brings together educators, curators, technologists. I think it's really important for us to shake up the structures in which talented employees work so that folks can really step forward and show how they see the larger enterprise and how they can contribute to the larger enterprise. So I'm a big advocate of forming teams of people who don't normally work together and letting them learn from each other and build something together.
Go ahead, Susan.
I think we are looking at a generational shift as well in talent and curatorial talent, and we're looking at a cohort of young curators who have skills and have a comfort level with delivery mechanisms for information. So historically, or I don't want to say historically, but for the last how many years, there have been two different delivery platforms in a museum. One is the curatorial and one is the object. There's the digital and the curatorial, and the information lives separately. And now that's no longer possible. It has to be merged. And so to talk about, it's no longer a function of I'm going to deliver the information and you're going to put it up. It's how do we deliver it together? And to your point of teams, it's a natural melding of talents and capacity that creates a completely different interpretive conversation in the space, in the art museum space today.
So we're talking a lot about structures, talking a lot about the way that our institutions are organized. But I also think there's something to be said for the way we're working. And Nick, you mentioned design thinking and thinking like human-centered design and iteration. And I'm front of my mind right now, Shelley, is your project, your iterative project that you're writing about. And so how important is that type of approach? And something you've done for most of your career, right? This idea of iteration and prototyping. And how important is that approach, do you feel, to your experience, but also museums in general? Do we need to be doing more of that, right?
I do think we need to be doing more of that. The thing that Jeff is talking about is the Barnes is going to start prototyping wearables and using wearables as a delivery mechanism based on some very specific things that we're seeing in the experience that's happening there. And for the first time, actually, I used to do projects which were like these, 3-month, 4-month, 6-month, 1-year projects where we would just go, ta-da, we're done. And that was great, but they were meant to be short. And then we did one project over at Brooklyn that was meant to be a long-term project, but what we did is we did a 1-year runway to get it out on the floor, and then we said, okay, we're going to change it from here. This is the first time that I've ever done a project where we're going, hey, we're going to prototype in the open. We're actually going to say we're going to use this technology that is kind of weird and can be kind of hard for visitors, but we think it's got some merit and we want to try it and we want to be as open as possible with it. I think some of my frustration comes, I think, both with you got to find the right funders, you got to have the right board who are behind you, you've got to have the right leadership that are behind you in those kinds of ideas, because basically what we're doing is we're saying, hey, this could very seriously fail. And that's okay because we're all going to learn a lot from it rather than just sort of putting something out there and then saying, okay, well, it's mostly working. And that's a big shift. I actually don't see that happening a lot. I think as an industry, my colleagues tend to hold their stuff pretty tight. I could almost guarantee you that almost everyone in this room is probably working on something awesome that you're not talking about, right? So I think one of the things that the Barnes is trying to do is to actually say, you know what, we're going to talk about everything. And we're going to hope that things go well, and when they don't, we're going to tell you why. So I would love to see a shift toward that.
Fantastic. Some more questions coming in from the web, and thank you. Please keep these coming. One is about speed and velocity, particularly for the director level in museums. Here's a question. It surprises me to hear we need to get started. We got started a long time ago. What are the hurdles, the speed bumps that are causing executives and directors to think that we haven't actually started? What is slowing down these catalysts for change, these opportunities?
Are we in the cone of silence?
Sort of.
We
except it's being
wish.
recorded. It's being
We wish.
recorded.
Okay. So I'm actually working with a bunch of museums on digital strategy. So I'll just use a very generic example of what I've seen in actually a couple of institutions. So I'm not going to single one out. And it is there is this kind of, what I'm observing is the directors are kind of put on this pedestal, and they're kind of leveraged by reports underneath them in terms of what they will be comfortable with and what they won't be comfortable with. And I've seen it a couple of times where projects are actually stopped because they are leveraging, well, the director isn't going to go for that. And if you can get over that, and I've had conversations with those directors, and when you talk to them, they're like, yeah, we should be doing that. And it's the total antithesis of what the expectation was. And I think it's a real, I see some nodding heads, so it's clearly not just a couple of museums that I'm working with. But I think there is we all know museums are hugely political places, which is why I think the transformation, it really does need to start from the bottom up. And so frameworks that you can, as kind of leading from where you are now, to kind of start that process of change, and whether it's leveraging projects to kind of drive change, or whether it's trying to embed some kind of process or cultural change from the ground up. I think there's two opportunities.
I mean, I'd like to see the executive staff get on the floor more, right? When I came to the Barnes, I'm at the executive level, and I was, doing audience observation, which I do pretty often, and I would have staff tell me, wow, nobody's been down here. Nobody's been, actually looking at what's happening. Nobody's coming to these events. I think that is a huge shift that we're making at the Barnes. We do monthly town halls now, where we get in a room and we talk about visitor experience on a monthly basis. We do quarterly tech town halls. So anytime we're talking about technology, we're talking about tools people use, we're talking about the experience staff are having, we're talking about that on a quarterly basis. I think we need to go beyond the all staff, right? I'm guessing we all have the all staffs where somebody gets up and gives a presentation, and then more people get up and give presentations, and we all are bored out of our minds and don't get to say anything, right? We need to mix it up, and we need to get out there.
There's a great little story, and I think part of it is about changing mindsets and changing culture from the top to the bottom. But in the history of technology adoption, there's a great little story about ATMs, right? So when the technology for the ATM was first created, it was understood to be an automated teller. That's still the name. So banks initially bought them and put them where they put tellers, in the bank. So you'd go in the bank and there'd be a human, a human, a human, a human, and then a machine. And they were not successful. Because once you were in the bank and the bank was open and you were standing there, right, why not go to a teller? And it was close to a dozen years after the technology was deployed in test cases before anybody said to themselves, maybe the point of this thing is that it could be available when the bank is closed. But it took 12 years for somebody to think about that. So the question is, what we have started, and if my comment suggested that I don't see that start, that wouldn't be true. I do see the start. But the culture change, the mindset change, when do we begin to ask ourselves the equivalent of, okay, you know, maybe this thing could actually stand outside when the bank is closed? And I think a lot of people, especially at board levels, at senior leadership and management levels, are beginning to see what those changes might be. I think we need to talk up and down as well as across our organizations about what those changes might be. But I think one of the hugest barriers is changing our own preconceptions about what we ought to be doing and really asking ourselves what these new tools encourage us to do.
Can I want to just respond to Nick's comments as a museum director. I think many museum directors don't even know what they don't know about technology. Right. And so it's a fundamental disconnect. And to create change is to unleash the opportunities and the talents. And at that moment, you have of staff. And at that moment, you have a much longer runway to create innovation. And I think that's one problem of our directors. And so the fear of what they don't know sometimes prevents innovation.
Right. But I think there's broad recognition that stuff has to change. And what I see is it is complicated. You know, if you're at the top of an organization, it's complicated, so how do you start? And I think that is often a barrier of what is the first step?
Exactly.
Because it's such a big topic. And certainly what I found is you've got to figure out how to simplify the conversation.
Yes.
And break it down.
Shelley, you want to get in on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think everything that I've heard here is true, but I think structure has to change. Structure in museums has to change if you want to be thinking about doing really interesting work. And that means, and I think it doesn't necessarily mean that the digital structure has to change. I think the whole structure of the museum has to change so that we're all talking to each other in more fluid ways, and there's a little bit of a mix-up, like visitor services and digital are together at the Barnes. We did that very specifically. We did that because we don't think digital projects can come in to the floor and be effective without the visitor services team completely and fully on board. I've seen amazing things out of Minneapolis, right, where they have done amazing structural changes. They've been thinking about what positions and where are going to make the most effective change. Once you make that change at the top, and I also believe it bubbles up from down here too, but I think you have to make that change at the top and that commitment up here, and then you put those people in place who start to funnel it down, right? And then you start to create a structure where it can start to bubble up. Because I've been in institutions in the before and the after, and I'm telling you the before doesn't work. The after, not sure. We're right in the middle of it, and I'll let you know. But it's definitely very, very different to be going in and having conversations about experience overall as a mandate, and not digital, not technology, not visitor services, not education, not interpretation, period.
I agree 100%. And the top down has to meet the bottom up. And I'm wondering about anybody on the panel, how a leader can start to foster this bottom up. What are some tactics? What are some ways that you've seen it done? Go ahead.
I think a big part of it is listening. So we started town halls at the Barnes, and about half the staff show up, which is pretty cool. At Brooklyn, we were running town halls, 10 people would show up, right? Like nobody would show up. But at the Barnes, I've got half the staff showing up. And they started after the third town hall, month 3, month 4. Somebody comes up to me and they say, hey, listen, these town halls are great, but the problem is we're trying to report on so much. You're trying to tell us about so much that's going on because like massive change is happening over there that we actually don't have enough time to discuss stuff. And I said, hey, you're right. So next time we're going to take this topic and we're now going to discuss this and make you a part of what's happening on this specific thing. And I wouldn't have known that had somebody not come up to me, and I don't think somebody would have come up to me if we hadn't opened the door in the first place to say, hey, this is actually an open forum. I need you to come in. I need you to tell me what's going on.
I would love to see honesty from directors. I would love them to just talk about what's going on inside their head. Because I think there is a lot of, there are some directors, and I've experienced this directly, who lead by ESP, and there's some implicit assumption that you know what's going on inside their head. And I wish they would, I kind of see fear on both sides. I see fear in staff who may think taking a risk is going to risk their job. I don't see much evidence of people losing their job for doing that. It's entirely possible that it's happened. And I see kind of fear on the part of the director who thinks they should know this stuff. It's totally fine that they don't know this stuff, and I wish they would just kind of open up and say, I don't know, this is what's going on in my head, how do we figure it out? And it's more about flattening that whole hierarchy and having those open conversations.
Yeah, I guess I think that you know what you want to accomplish, you know you want to engage visitors, and you have an idea of the magnitude of it and the importance of it, but you don't know how. And so the how is where the people who have the experience, who are on the floor, who are with the visitor services, they tell the story, and they know how to tell the story. And I think you're right. It's to be honest and open with your staff, and we've had lots of discussions about, I'm the first one to say, I have no idea what you're talking about, but please go forth and conquer, because it's a really important moment for a museum to engage this way. So I completely agree with you.
Well, and as a CEO over 4 museums, I would just add that we too are trying to get better at listening, doing the town hall kinds of things. We do these coffees, But it's really important for those of us who have resources under our command, and I mean monetary resources, but also reputational resources, to make sure that when somebody bravely bubbles something up, that they get recognized and they get rewarded. And that when somebody bubbles something up, those of us who have authority need to throw ourselves behind it to make sure that pretty quickly a bubble works, right? Because if you invite people to bubble up their best ideas and they do it visibly 2 or 3 or 4 times and it doesn't draw any recognition, it doesn't draw any reward, and it doesn't work, they're never going to believe you that you want the stuff to bubble up. So you need a champion. And you need a champion at a high enough level to be able to dedicate some resources. And I'm not saying that you just reward everything that bubbles up, because a lot of what bubbles up will fail, should fail, right? But when staff take that leap and they come up with something promising and a little different and a little challenging, I think it's very good to think early on about who is going to be the champion for this process and what real resources do they have. So if somebody brings me a great idea in one of our coffee hours, I need to make sure I throw myself behind making it happen if I want the next good idea to come to me.
And we should also celebrate failure. I think in the same way, if people fail, I think you've got to pat them on the back and say, nice try, let's figure out why it went wrong, and let's do either tweak it, pivot, or let's just not do that again.
There are some questions actually that dovetail really nicely with this. Joellen, you talk about that moment, that bubble up moment. What are some kind of nuts and bolts ways that folks in this crowd can bring ideas to you? What is the best way to approach you with a new idea?
Oh gosh, there are several. I certainly do try to invite direct conversation, but I know that's very comfortable for some people and not very comfortable for other people. So we tried to create some new groupings of employees. For example, we created just a few months ago a group of mid-career emerging leaders from across all the functions in all 4 of our museums, right? It may be that somebody in that group hears something, gets wind of something that maybe the originator of that idea would never think to tell me about, but somebody in that group hears it. And they know they've got my ear, so they bring it to me. We do try to have things like, Jeff leads them, innovation salons, which happen in the evening, which all staff are invited to. And they have a presentational component, but they always have a conversational component. And if it's okay for me to say this, they also have an evening component, sometimes called Drinking About Museums. These are great opportunities for ideas to bubble up. So I do think it's important to create multiple paths and multiple pathways. People are very different in the way they choose to communicate their thoughts. They're very different in the point where they know they've got an idea, right? Some people test things by a lot of conversation. Some people hatch things quietly. And so I try personally to use personal conversation, to spend a lot of time on the floors of our museums myself, to create intermediary groups that may catch things that I would never hear about, to encourage people to get together to talk to each other, and hope that my relationships with folks in all those settings are strong enough that if the originator of a great idea doesn't bring it to me, somebody else hears about it and lets me know. It's not a perfect system, but it's sort of keeping all senses open as much of the time as you can.
But, there's an inherent problem here, which I think is what Shelley said right at the beginning about the hierarchical structure that we have. And there is this perception that things have to go up a recognized chain for approval and sometimes never get to the top. I mean, sometimes they don't need to go all the way to the top, but I think, I take it back to the keynote, that the comparison of that hierarchy diagram and the snowflake diagram, that snowflake is really the change that we should have, so that you do have access to, anybody has access to anybody in an organization and has the comfort and that comfort level to be able to go and here's an idea, I want to try it, or
It's interesting. I think the Oakland Museum of Art is the only museum that has a snowflake. And that snowflake isn't centered around the director being at the center. It's centered around an idea being at the center, which is about, for them, visitor experience and how everybody sort of interlocks with that idea. And I think that sort of speaks to mission-centered design, right? How clear are our missions? How clear is our direction? I've worked at Brooklyn for many years where I would say, and I am hoping there are going to be some nodding heads in here, that the mission was really, really pretty clear and very specific. You could interpret it in many ways, but for the most part, even if you interpreted it slightly differently, you were still on the same path overall. And over a number of years, we saw great change toward that particular idea because that was so clear.
I'd love to get on my soapbox now. This is an appropriate time. It's true, Oakland, I think, is the only one, and it's a fantastic structure. There used to be one chink in that armor, and it's called the annual performance appraisal. And by sticking to that model, you still retain this hierarchical structure. And I would love, I'm looking for an institution. I have an idea about a performance appraisal process, which is kind of, anybody who flies with Expedia will know what I'm about to talk about. That just kind of feedback often, all the time, on some, a couple of metrics. It's not, it's done by your peers. Most of your supervisors have no idea what you're doing, I guarantee it, but they're responsible for, giving you direction. I would love to see a much more democratic process for helping people progress in their career and improve. I'm off my soapbox now.
We've segued nicely into communicating change, and we talked about championing ideas that bubble up. And Nick, you just talked a little bit about the hat that a senior leader has to wear when it comes to being an enforcer, right? when it comes to policy, like report or whatever. There's also a hat of a politician. When you realize that this idea that bubbled up needs to go through the politics of the board, of all this stuff. So these the many hats that senior leaders wear. Can Susan, maybe you can speak to the nuances of having to balance all of this and how you do that?
Well, One, I think, important component of any director's position and chair of any board is to look at the composition of a board and determine what's necessary, what kinds of capacities and talents and skills are necessary in order to affect change and carry out priorities of an institution. So I think that's a kind of managing up phenomenon where that's identified and positioned and move forward. So that for us is one of the outcomes, one of the important outcomes of our last planning process, is to get people in the room who know what we're talking about and who understand what it takes. And that then becomes a communication opportunity for those staff who have the ideas, who want to engage, and to engage with the board members, not the siloed, the siloed moments are gone. The staff really needs to engage with these other thinkers and to connect their ideas to our board's capacity, both in terms of creativity and financial wherewithal. So we're a much more integrated structure in terms of getting good ideas together with people who have the potential to carry them out.
I have an observation about boards, which is I think most of them don't really know what, and present company accepted, don't really know what their role is, because I actually don't think they've actually been told explicitly. You know, we, for all of us who are collecting institutions, you know, we hold those collections in the public trust. For that, we receive a, tax exemption, and the board is meant to represent the public. You know, it should look like the public. How's that working out for everyone? Because in many respects, I don't think it does, and I don't think the public, the board, have been told that you are meant to be representing the public. I think they're there to steward the institution, and I think that's a completely different thing. I'm just lobbing these kind of bombs out there.
That's another panel that would take hours.
I want to make sure we're accepting questions through the URL, but I just want to make sure that we're accommodating anyone who just wants to verbally ask a question. If you do, just let me know, and we can get into it. We good right now? Okay. Maybe we'll shift gears and switch into this idea of museum work of tomorrow. Joellen, what skill sets, roles do you see down the road as being integral to the future of museums?
This is something I've thought about a lot based on an analogy to higher education, but let me tell you a little bit about that process, and really you all will have thoughts about how this would play out in the museum world. Many years ago when I was leading educational institutions, it was very clear that there were faculty, there were technologists, there were student services people, there were librarians in their different silos, right? And a great deal of time and energy went into what we used to call midwifing new professions, bringing those people together to begin to figure out why, yeah, you might want an academic librarian who knows gaming, right? Yeah, you might want student services people who understand social media. And what emerged over time from that is a concept that's pretty familiar now in higher education, the instructional technologist, right? The idea that there's somebody who understands education, human development, subject area, and technology, and combines all of those in a practice as a kind of holistic professional. We need to midwife the museum technologist in the same way. We need to have those roles, if you imagine a Venn diagram, that are operating at the intersection of curatorial, education, community outreach, fundraising, and technology, right? We need technologists who understand how grants work and how grant reports work and how education programs work. We need curators who understand how technologists work and education folks work. And I can't yet see precisely where that is going to gel, right, that new role. But I have a strong sense of what it needs to look like, and it will emerge in the interstices between curatorial, educational, technology, and visitor experience. The way I think it will mature is by creating these kind of cross-disciplinary teams and supporting them. Initially, people will have to educate each other. Over time, academic programs, professional development programs will emerge that address this need. And conferences like this will begin to pave the way. I would love to see you all adopt a Bring a Buddy program. And if everybody here came to MCN bringing arm in arm with them, somebody from a different field than theirs within the museum, it would be great, because it's those kinds of conversations that will ultimately lead to people revising job descriptions, revising job titles. We created a position at Carnegie called the Diversity Catalyst. Very different vision than a manager or a coordinator of diversity. So I think we need to promote those kinds of conversations among ourselves as a professional community in the hopes that professional organizations and academic training programs will begin to pick up on that and offer people tracks and a way to develop those skills intentionally. But now we've got to talk to each other and all move into that interstitial space between those disciplines.
I have one other example. I know, Mary, you have a question. At the Getty, 6-7 years ago, they hired a paintings curator who had no art history background, but had an MBA. And Scott Schaefer, the head of the curatorial department, had seen this guy who had a kind of, an amateur interest in art history give a lecture. I can't remember what it was, but it was highly specialized, and it was the most engaging thing he'd ever heard around art history, and so he hired him. There were a whole bunch of raised eyebrows, but he came in, and his approach to exhibitions was as a business, and he brought in all these other departments who were normally excluded from the exhibition planning process, like the store. And created these fantastic exhibitions that were kind of really well-rounded, well-received, and supported by the institution. It was very interesting.
Great. Right. I don't know if we can. There we go.
Thanks, Chad. So we're a sector where we're for the most part, in it not for the money, but for the passion for our institutions, for the art, for the history. I'm very interested in what you just addressed, Joel, and with the new skill sets we need to attract to our institutions in order to stay agile and relevant and audience-focused today. Those skills cannot always be bought for the kinds of museum money that we normally pay salaries with. So my question is, what are you willing to sacrifice in terms of prioritization of the things we usually do in museums in order to ensure that we have these new important skill sets in our institutions?
I think one of the most challenging thing any institution undertakes, and this is a very important point because we are institutions. Right, we're in it for the long haul. Our organization is 125 years old, nearly, and the intention is to be here for the next century. So we're not entrepreneurial organizations that can flame up and subside. We're in it for the long haul, and that gives us a lot of historical weight to change. It is almost impossible to get people in any area of a museum, I would say right now, in visitor services, in education, in curatorial, even in technology, to make a list of the 5 things that maybe they don't really need to do next year. We have a lot of legacy activity. We have a lot of legacy activity that we conduct because we've always conducted it. And one of my first steps toward making the kind of budgetary space for the acquisition of the new skills that we need is to actually advance a conversation about maybe there are old skills that we no longer need, And maybe there are pieces of work that we conduct that we need no longer conduct. And this is where the operational side of IT can actually help. We've been talking a lot about the programmatic and the visitor-facing side. Now, I will tell you that until very, very recently at the Carnegie Museums, if you wanted to, request vacation time, you did that on paper. And you put your expense reimbursement forms in on paper. And somebody like me would get a stack of them this high and spend an hour signing them. Work that does not need to be done. Performance appraisal is an example, perhaps, of work that does not need to be done. So, without minimizing the very real problem, right? If we talk about what we do want to do right now, we have to be willing to talk about what we used to do that maybe we don't need to do anymore. And that is a tough, tough, tough conversation for us. Nobody wants to have that conversation, but it's the essential one. Because we know the reality of the economics of cultural organizations in our society, none of us can just grow additively. We can't keep doing everything we've always done and just add the skill sets, add the programs. It's not sustainable. The resources are not there. So we've got to have a strategy of replacement in which we identify some things we no longer need in order to seek those highly valued things we now want.
I have been in higher education prior to my position in New Orleans, and one college president once said to me, well, we really need to think about growth through substitution. And it was a concept that at the time was incredibly foreign to me because it was just grow, 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 and growing through substitution kind of echoes, in essence, what you're saying. I do think, however, that there are museums whose budgets are so tight and whose resources are so limited that it's important to allow professional development to take center stage and to be front and center for those people who both want it and need it, or who see a future that allows them to engage with these kinds of growth opportunities that are possible. And I think so for institutions who are have constricted budgets, mine is one of them, we are trying to create a pool of funds in order to allow people to build a skill set and create broader discussions within the staff about what are the skills that are appealing to them and are necessary for the institution. And that point of intersection is where we hope to grow the capacity and therefore the professional development of the staff.
So that was a great question, Marit, and I totally agree with you. And it's so depressing, because in any other industry, that passion would be put at a premium, and that's part of what we're struggling with. And I totally get what you say, Joellen, because that's kind of the model that we're in. We don't have this capacity to have this explosive growth. I love what you said, Susan. There was it was characterized differently yesterday by Coven in a session that Shelley and I were in, where he said the museum community is totally comfortable with additive change, but not with subtractive change. And it was an aha moment for me, and as you might expect, Coven always comes up with these aha moments. And I wonder, the topic we have, behind us is, museum work of tomorrow, and we are starting to see, and I work in a world, my staff is half full-time staff and half freelancers. Some of them are local, some of them aren't. One freelancer is now just moving to Chicago, but she's going to continue to do exactly the same job that she does right now. And I wonder whether this kind of so-called, I think AAM referred to it as a gig economy, whether that isn't a solution for this, where curators or educators or technologists are actually working for a number of institutions. You see there are these frameworks in place now. People working, for shared curators. I mean, this more distributed model of contribution to an organization might be a solution to get around paying appropriately for the skill set and passion that you are getting from individuals.
So I want to make sure we leave some time to talk about prominent threads coming out of this conference this year. But before we get off museum work of tomorrow, there's just one interesting question I'd love to throw maybe at Shelley. Somebody's wondering out loud here. Most museum directors haven't spent the bulk of their career in the social media open communication age. What do you see a field of millennial or younger museum directors looking like? And is there a way that we can start laying the foundation for a successful shift?
Well, I hope it's about openness, right? But then again, I was just here talking about like how we're not being open enough with what we're developing. I would hope that the shift is toward talking about what you're doing, being very open with both your audiences, your colleagues, your board members, your, everything. And I think there is a way to sort of do that. I think we're sort of doing that. You see me be very careful when I publish things in print about sort of the way I phrase certain things, that if you read between the lines, you're like, oh boy, there's a little bit of an issue here. But I'm always pretty honest about what's going on, and I think there are ways we can start to do that, and should be doing that for the good of everybody. And I think it also points back to a lot of the issues that we've already talked to here today about where people don't feel in the staff like maybe they have access to the director or know what the director is thinking or know what all of the staff are thinking. And my most productive conversations is when we're sort of not all together necessarily, but when we're all open. So when we're all there and we're all saying exactly what we feel about it, and we're not holding back, and we're not worried about hurting each other's feelings, we're just going for it, that's when I think we become true colleagues. So as we start to move through this sort of new generation, that's what I'd like to see more of happening.
Great, here's a question coming in from Twitter. Do you agree with Max Anderson's assertion that execs only care about people and buzz? What are the key challenges for the panel? People and what? Buzz.
Buzz. So it's Max,
Max.
You got to have somebody on the fringes, I guess. Lobbing comments out. I really don't think that's true, though. I think that may be. Oh, no, I'm going to say that.
Provocative statement.
Either a provocative statement, or I can't believe I'm going to say this, more of a reflection on him.
I think, my reaction would be that I would take exception to the only. I'm pretty proud of caring about people. I wouldn't want to be in the I don't care about people camp. So caring about people, that's a good thing. Buzz is another word for openness. People are talking about what you're doing. That's not a bad thing. Do I only care about that? Do I think most of my colleagues only care about that? No. We care deeply about art and history and science and many, many things. So it's, for me, yeah, people are great. I'm all about the people in the museum. I'm all about the people who create the museum and visit the museum. Buzz, that's cool. That's people talking about what we're doing. I'm all for those things. I'm for other things as well. And at the risk of being maybe a little tangentious, I think we've seen recently what some of the implications of a lot of buzz without any substance can be. So I'm all pro-substance, right? And I think part of where we can be in the world of buzz and social media is the credible. So I'm all about credibility too. We can be the historically informed, we can be the objectively grounded, we can be the credible. So I'm not anti-buzz, but I like buzz with credibility.
I'm just going to say 2 words and then drop the mic. Uptown Funk. You see that? Okay.
Since we're talking about people, and since the theme of this conference is the human-centered museum, one of the things I've seen, naturally inclusion is a very important topic that we've been talking about here this week. One of the things I've seen in the sessions that I have attended is the idea that technology or data collection carries with it forms of social inherent bias. And I'm wondering, at the top level, is that we need to be thinking about that, but how do you see addressing that when it comes to the way that we interact with our constituents and learn more and more and more about them?
Say more, Jeff, about the ground of the concern, digital divide stuff?
No, not digital divide, but the idea that with technology and with data collection comes an element of power, comes an element of trust, right? So, Shelley, you?
I was like, we were just having this discussion last night. You know, I think there are ways to get data. You know, I think everybody is afraid of the issues of data and data collection and what that means, and to the point where we say, okay, well, we don't want to collect it. And we don't want to go down that road. That's not a road we want to go down. That's what happened on Ask. You know, we said, hey, when you use Ask at the Brooklyn Museum, you're going to be totally anonymous and we're not going to collect any data about you. But here's the problem with it. At the end of the day, we don't know anything about you. We have no way to grow that relationship. We have no way to think about that relationship for the future. And it just bottoms out. You can come back, you can use that app, you can have another great experience with that app, and that's great. But again, we don't really know you. So I think there are two big things that we have to actually think about is how to do it and how to do it right and how to do it respectfully. Because there is a way, and it's something that we're going to be working on at the Barnes very, very soon. And we'll be publishing about that. And then the second is, what about the audiences that we don't know, right? If you're thinking about audience development, and this is especially true for the Barnes, where we just, you know, we're 5 years in Philadelphia now, and we're trying to transform our audiences to be more reflective of the city of Philadelphia, that's a huge leap. So one of the big things that we're doing is a lot of surveying of people who actually don't come, have no idea who we are, to try and figure out what motivates them and what we can do in that sort of abstract area of the things we don't know.
Cool, we have just a few minutes. I want to make sure that, any questions out there? No, okay. Before we wrap up, I want to throw one question at all of you. Maybe you could each kind of get out your crystal balls and look on the long tail, the long future. Describe briefly what the 22nd Century Museum looks like to you.
That's really unfair.
I thought about this one a lot because it is a hard question. It's easy to come up with all these silly ideas. We'll all be cruising through on hoverboards or whatever. But the reality of what I actually think is that we may well see seismic shifts in the sector. And I think there are the major, what I call pilgrimage museums, the Louvre, the National Gallery, right, the Vatican. They'll be fine. They'll be able to go on pretty much doing what they're doing in pretty much the same way they're doing it now, and that will be fine. And I think many other museums at other points on the scale are essentially going to take shape as community and educational centers for people who are passionate about a specific thing, history, science, art, whatever it is. So my guess is not so much the 22nd Century Museum, but the 22nd Century Museum sector, we're probably going to see a lot of consolidation, a lot of movement to the legacy pilgrimage, museums at the top that retain a historically conventional definition of museum, and that at lower levels in the ecosystem, we're going to see a shift to a much more populist, much more audience-engaging, educationally driven, community center kind of a venue.
Just to pick up on that, I think that's a interesting and accurate possibility. I think that museums today, I'm much more idealistic about the future of art museums because I believe that art can be a catalyst for change and can be a catalyst for knowledge and information about in many different sectors, whether it's history or science or art or literature, music, film, all of that. So I see art museums maintaining a kind of pride of place in terms of their commitments to the visual, but what the visual becomes is something that we're not quite sure about. So whether it's virtual reality or performance-based or film, whatever it becomes, it's about the creative process, the creative act. So how museums respond to notions of creativity will drive what museums become. And I think that as this place of cultural convergence, I like to talk about the convergence of disciplines and mediums, because I do believe that that's critical to the future of our culture and to the future of museums. So I see it in a very engaging, interactive, and dynamic way with audiences.
You know, never good going third after trying to predict the future. I think you won't be able to distinguish between a university or the education system and the museum field. I think it will be just this thing. And the irony of that is, you know, museums used to be universities, or universities used to be museums. I mean, you know, you see standards now coming out about, you know, teaching from primary source. I just see you just see the burgeoning education system. You see the opportunity that the museum field has. I mean, it seems like a perfect marriage to me. And I just think you'll see that just blur more and more.
Museums like to describe themselves as centers for lifelong learning, you know, from the earliest to the latest. And that's how many of how we are all positioning ourselves as a place where there's a continuum of learning from the earliest moments to other moments in people's lives. So.
Can I ask you, how many of you find that question helpful? Great. So I don't find that a helpful question, and I'm going to be the jerk who ends this by saying that it's not helpful, because I think what it does to us is it tells us that there is some end that we are trying to get to, that there is some next future that we're trying to create, right? And I think so much of what you hear at this conference is actually the opposite, right? Where we're trying to go through an agile process, and we're trying to go through iterative design. We're trying to think about how to go through a process that doesn't necessarily have that end like we think of it, but rather is more about the day thing that we go through to get to that answer. So I think by thinking about that answer, we're not acknowledging that there isn't one, and we actually need to start moving toward figuring it out day by day. And it's not figuring it out, it's just figuring out how to go forward and keep going.
You should drop the mic now.
Drop it. Drop it. Thank you very much to the panel, Shelley, Nick, Susan, and Joellen. Thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.